30 Years of Watchtower Slave, Chapter 10, entitled Pioneers, O Pioneers. The first subheading is On the Outside. The author arrived in New York in June of 1927, and he mentions that even though he again got thoroughly involved with the Watchtower Society as he had in Germany, it was a mechanical and detached involvement here in the United States, and never again was it to be based on love or admiration for the Watchtower Society. During the time of adjustments from 1927 to 1931, he stayed on the outside of things as far as the Watchtower Society was concerned. However, his family and father, relatives, and so on and so forth were all staunch Watchtower adherents living in Berlin. And eventually they came back to the U.S. with him and got acclimated to this country once again and started to associate with the brothers and sisters there in Brooklyn. And he sensed constant pressure from his family to pioneer because that was the thing to do. But reluctantly, he caved into pressure. And probably you have had the same family pressure or peer pressure from those in your congregation to pioneer. They're always encouraging every witness to do that. The next subheading is entitled America Lags. The author noticed that in every way the organization in America was behind what was accomplished there in Germany, especially as far as the printery was concerned. But in the congregations too, they were behind from what was happening in Germany. Here in America, the elders still held a lot of power and sway in the congregations, and many Bible students refused to fully bow down to the Watchtower Society. That wasn't the case in Germany. He mentions everything, in fact, was much slower than it had been in Germany. So the next subheading is Why the Delay? Well, he mentions that he has an inquisitive mind and he wanted to analyze and set out to discover why things were slowing down or not progressing as they were in Germany, because he had been in the Bethel, Germany for 3.5 years and he saw much progress. So the things had to go much slower in America because of the character of people. Americans, as he says, typically rebelled at regimentation, and so they needed to use emotional and business tactics on the Americans. The Americans were not in an unsettled condition of circumstances as those in Germany. The Americans had very much an advantage in that area, aside from the Great Depression, which we talked about earlier. The Americans enjoyed many things that other countries did not. But as we just talked about, in 1929 in America came the Watchtower's golden opportunity. We had the Great Depression, and this was a godsend to the Watchtower. Of course, they used this as a sign that the end was near, just like they do that with everything else. And so again, with the Great Depression, there were vast pools of troubled waters that were forming, and it was soon to be good fishing for the Watchtower Society. Easy pickings. The next subheading is entitled I Rejoin the Ranks. So in order to get sufficient loyal personnel trained, the Watchtower Society initiated the Pioneer Service, which was the successor to the co-porter service work that was done under C.T. Russell. So again, we see Joseph Rutherford trying to get as far away as he can from anything having to do with Charles Taze Russell. So we have the Pioneer Service. So the Watchtower ranks, they increased greatly in numbers when the Depression hit. Go figure. And many of these newcomers naturally gravitated toward Pioneer Service. One day in the summer of 1931, his family hitched the Ford to the trailer and began to pioneer in a county in upstate New York. During this time, of course, the Watchtower as well as his family put constant pressure on people to pioneer. And he mentions that finally in 1933, after 2 years of resisting, he finally consented to the pioneer work. I don't remember exactly how many hours, but I believe it was about 120 hours that pioneers had to put in those days. Nowadays, I think pioneers have to put in 70 hours, so it's nearly half of what they had to do back then. Nothing's the same as it was back then. The next subheading is entitled Watchtower Charity. Since the Watchtower organization is frankly all about the New World Society, they can't afford to do any charitable organizational work. All of their money stays with them. They give, but they receive and receive, but do not give. So when the Watchtower talks badly about Christendom for its organized charities, they cleverly throw up a smokescreen to divert attention from the complete lack of charitable work of the so-called theocratic organization. But you go figure, they do insist that they do charity. How so? Well, in their preaching work, by going from house to house and by bringing people to the kingdom halls and by selling magazines, they are doing a work of charity. Like a Watchtower magazine could pay for your bills or put food on the table. I don't think that's a charity work, but that's what the Jehovah's Witnesses are sticking to. And so therefore, because of their charity work, they can talk down upon Christendom for their charity work, that they actually do provide food for people and pay bills and provide shelter. But that comes from Satan's organization. So since the Watchtower organization is not charitable in any true sense of the word, the pioneers were soon taught not to look for any financial support from the society in any measure. While they claimed authority to tell the pioneers how to work and how many hours to put in each month, they didn't follow through with any financial support. It was a sales organization with free labor. And at that time, they received their books for 8 cents a copy and sold them for 35 cents. If a pioneer over a period of time failed for any reason to pay his bill, the society stopped sending him books until he cleared up his account. Wow. I never went into the field service on my own during the time that books had a charge for them. Mine was always under the donation arrangement, but I could only imagine how it was during those decades. The next subheading is entitled Pioneer Days. So we soon found out that money was scarce in the country, especially among the farmers. And so this led to them to develop a typical business approach. They would tactfully explain that they accepted produce instead of money for their books. They developed a barter arrangement. So with such arrangement arranged, they picked their counties to go preaching according to the produce that was available. Go figure. So they worked these counties during the seasons when they were marketable. So when the produce was good, they would preach in those counties that didn't have very much money among the farmers. So he goes on to mention a few different experiences during his pioneer work. And he mentions that the pioneers during those days were an intrepid group. They were fearless. Even though they weren't pioneers for Christianity, they were true pioneers of the coming Watchtower society. And they laid the groundwork for the most totalitarian organization which ever spawned in liberty-living America and upon the freedom-loving soil. The next subheading is entitled, "The Pioneers Are Demoted." So as book sales declined and people started catching on the real reason why Jehovah's Witnesses showed up at their doors, and that was to sell books and magazines, well, book sales declined. And so therefore, if book sales declined, the importance of pioneers would decline as well. And what did they do to the pioneers? They just basically assigned them to different areas. Some became special pioneers during the war years. Some became company servants or presiding overseers, I think is what we call them today. Some became zone servants, circuit overseers, and district overseers, so on and so forth. And some also went into the Gilead missionary work. The next subheading is entitled Doctrinal Developments. So the doctrinal development within the Watchtower organization in America from 1927 to 1931 was to a great extent a repetition of what had previously taken place in Germany. But as we mentioned, Americans were a little stubborn, so they needed to use more subtle means. And this was done by shifting the weight and burden of scriptural truths into the field of generalities, thereby creating new and broader meaning of the scriptures, which Jehovah's Witnesses eat up as new truths. So we see the pattern here. They begin calling these new truths new light, and so on and so forth. And so, of course, anyone under the Watchtower Society had to be nourished and sustained from a continuous flow of Watchtower magazines from the Brooklyn presses. And this way, the Watchtower Society was fulfilling its role as the faithful and discreet slave, or as they called it back then, the faithful and wise servant, who was providing food in due season. So the significant in this connection was the appearance of the book Government in 1928. The author mentions it was a masterpiece of feigned words, laying the groundwork for the future theocratic structure. This book set the stage for coming theocracy and directed the trend of thought toward the acceptance of a top-down dictatorship. I invite you to go to websites online such as archive.org, and you can download this book entitled Government, published by the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society in the year 1928. This will conclude this chapter, and stay tuned for the next. Thank you for taking time to watch and listen to this presentation. Post your comments, like and share this video, subscribe to my channel, and stay tuned for the next chapter.